Hi, we continue in Luke 6 today, and we'll be introducing the Sermon on the Plain, Luke's version of what the more familiar expression in Matthew's Gospel is often called the Sermon on the Mount. So much more familiar that when I was searching the internet and various other sources for art that illustrates this story, almost all of them were titled Sermon on the Mount and show Jesus up on a mountain, very few on the Sermon on the Plain. As we'll see in a minute from Malawian scholar Louis Nadeka, it's not only unfamiliar because the Sermon on the Mount has gotten more art and cultural attention, it's unfamiliar because it's so radical that many people just simply don't want to hear it. But we are going to hear it because it's good news for everybody, not just for the poor who are the beneficiaries of the blessings that we'll hear there in the next video, but it's good news for everybody to be living the way that Jesus is calling people to live. So there are a number of issues to look at before we begin to investigate the sermon in itself. First of all, let's look at where Luke puts it. We've been in chapter 6 here, and so several things to say about that. In our last few videos, we've looked at the healing on the Sabbath and eating food on the Sabbath as challenges to the Pharisees. And we recognize that we're in chapter 6, which is to say a lot has happened already. Jesus' introduction was given in Matthew and Luke in very similar ways, with stories from before they were born, what we think of as the infancy stories, although a lot of them are not about his infancy, but about before he was even conceived. But after that, both Matthew and Luke include the baptismal story of John the Baptist, and both have some kind of genealogical list. But Matthew then jumps right in after the call of the disciples, and the Sermon on the Mount is almost the first thing you know about Matthew's version of what Jesus' message is. Whereas in Luke, Jesus has already done a number of things. He's already, of course, gone into his hometown and proclaimed the fulfillment of Isaiah 61, making Jubilee his primary mission. And we've seen him, as we just noted, confronting the Pharisees and other elements. So when we look at the Sermon on the Plain, we'll see it's already echoing things we've seen before, and it'll also anticipate things we've seen later. So it's not a unique piece in Luke. It's simply a collection of Jesus' wisdom, that almost all of which could be found elsewhere in the Gospel, although not quite all, as we'll see. So the narrative context, an issue we've been looking at in terms of other ways that Luke borrows from Mark, is also relevant here. And of course, Mark doesn't have either of these sermons or anything like it, so we'll look at that issue in just a minute. One of the questions is, what's the cultural context to interpret it? In other words, is it directed by Luke at his Greco-Roman audience? Is it directed by Jesus at a Jewish audience? Or is there some combination of both? And we're going to look at two scholars today. I want to show you their articles first, then I'll show you something of what they have to say about this. This is Louis Nadeka, and here's a picture of him giving a talk on YouTube on a very similar topic. And as you can tell from the article title, a panegyric reading of Luke 6:20 to 49 in a Malawian context. And he notes here right at the very beginning, and I want to highlight this here, the Sermon on the Plain has historically occupied an insignificant place in African biblical hermeneutics. And as he says here, the one possible reason for its apparent irrelevance is the way the sermon's macarisms, which is the word for blessings, and woes, put in the spotlight the relationship between the rich and the poor. This, as he calls it, leftist stance creates a potential hermeneutical complexity that baffles interpreters. As a result, even in a majority Christian nation like Malawi, one rarely hears a homily on the sermon. And he goes on to say, with the growing influence of the prosperity gospel in Africa, the sermon is often read from a perspective of social control rather than one that would challenge the dominating economic reality of inequality in Africa. So that's one element we have to pay attention to, is right from the beginning, Luke's message is radical. And Jesus' sermon here is not one that most people would want to hear, and yet Luke makes it very plain what it's about there. The other author that we're going to look at here is Julia Vanderbrink, who's from New Zealand. As she notes in her faculty page, her name comes by marriage to a Dutchman. But she's from a small town in New Zealand, and she was going to read this in terms, as the title says there, Luke's Beatitudes and Woes. Are they covenant blessings and curses? And so we can look at both of these together, looking at Nadeka's view on the top and Vanderbrink's below, just in a one-sentence summary. I'll put the citations, their articles on the webpage, and I attached the various things from this video that you'll see. So his notion that it's Greco-Roman panegyrics, what that means is the public juxtaposition of praise and blame combined with exhortation in order to affirm social concord between the citizens in a given city. And the quote from him is that panegyrics acted as carriers of social memory of what was honorable in the community. In other words, in that context, is trying to affirm what the dominant views and traditions of the cities are, so that everybody's on board with this is how we do things here. Whereas what he points out is what Luke's doing is turning it completely upside down. And there are many authors have noted how Luke's view is completely upside down from almost every cultural context it might be found in. Vandenbrinks, on the other hand, looks at it in comparison with texts like Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, which list blessings and curses for a certain way of life, not necessarily in those words, which is why I have those in quotes. Like Leviticus 26 illustrates what happens if you practice the Jubilee that's described in Leviticus 25. And if you do it, all kinds of wonderful things will happen, and if you don't, all kinds of terrible things will happen. So she suggests reading it in terms of the comparison of Hebrew Scripture blessings and curses. And I'd like to suggest we don't need to make a choice, that these are both true, that Luke is constantly using the Septuagint and the Hebrew Scripture. In fact, as we saw, Jesus' whole portrait, according to Luke, is he's fulfilling Scripture, starting with Isaiah 61, but as we've seen already, and we'll see much more, many other ranges of Scripture besides that one passage. But Luke is also speaking to his audience of what I understand to be young adult people formed in the Greek educational prospect of paideia, which is as much American education is, not just the mechanics of learning, but an ideological perspective on one's role in relation to the status quo of one's nation and one's economy. And so here we can see that Luke's taking that message and then turning it upside down, comparing the traditional panegyrics of conforming to Greco-Roman society with Luke's version. So we're going to see that it echoes against Greco-Roman panegyrics, but echoes positively much in the Hebrew Bible. I can't say this too many times. Luke's Jesus is not writing or acting contrary to the Hebrew Scripture, but in fulfillment of it. So let's look at a brief outline of it, and this is just an outline. Some scholars suggest there is no order to it, there's no structure to it at all. The Beatitudes and Woes are clearly parallel, but some suggest it's just a loose collection and don't really see a structure. So I'm not making any big claims on this other than ways we can divide it up so we can see it in its different pieces. And I think there is some evidence that there are structural elements, despite some scholars having given up on it. So after the introduction, which includes not just this introductory phrase here in verse 20, but the verses we're not going to look at this time in 18 and 19 that set up the act of it, and we'll look at that next time along with the Beatitudes. We have these parallel blessings and woes. And in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, as we'll see in just a moment, there are only blessings, there are no woes. The woes are also parallel to texts from 1st Enoch that we'll look at when we get to that there. So it starts with these straightforward statements. They are not questionable, they're not parables, they're just simply straightforward. Blessed are you in this case, or blessed are you in that case, or woe to you in this case, or woe to you in that case. And so after those, then there's a range of things, and he introduces a new section here by saying, I say to you that listen. And when we get there, we'll talk about what that might mean. And I'd like to suggest there's at least a rough chiasm here. We've seen chiasms a number of times. You can see it if you haven't looked at chiasms before. The basic color coding here, where the beginning and the end match, the parts marked A here. And then the intersections match the parts marked B here, and there's a center place there. And plainly we can see elements of this A parallel. The love your enemies repeated twice, and the do good repeated twice, and no other elements are repeated that way. And that frames at the center what most people call the golden rule: do to others as you would have them do to you. And then framed around that are examples of what love and doing good and blessing and praying are like to one's opponents. So several examples of these: if people do these negative things to you, then what are you supposed to do? And then there's a section about what is the scope of the people you do it to, not just those you love or those who do good to you or those who lend to you, but others. And the refrain we can see with what credit is that to you. And so then the chiastic section completes with, again, its repetition, but a promise of reward there. And we'll see the parallels there that match the A part up here. Then there are parables, and the narrator again introduces with he told them a parable. So we can't assume that all sections are parables, but they are, if not parables, at least comparisons. And it starts off with parables about seeing, several examples of parables about seeing. First in here is this one line about the disciple not above the teacher. But here it's about being a blind person, being a guide, or the speck in the eye, and cleaning out your eye before you can help somebody else. So a little parable about one's role in relation to helping others, but also then this beginning of setting up conclusions about good trees and bad trees and good fruit and bad fruit, and then about good people and bad people and what comes out of their heart. So fruitfulness, both metaphorically compared to trees, and then metaphorically compared to heart. Because pulling that's also a metaphor, because literally treasure does not come out of one's heart, or evil treasure from one's heart either. And then after this questioning line here, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? There's a concluding simile, and it's introduced that way. I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, making it a simile, who hears my words and acts on them. And it's a comparison of two houses, one on a solid foundation and one not on a solid foundation when the flood comes and the river pushes against it. So that's an outline of that, and we'll be going through it in some detail as we go, looking at how the structure serves the message that Jesus is trying to get across. But as I was also hinting at here, there are parallel elements between Luke's Sermon on the Plain and Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. First of all, we should note that Luke's version here is 29 verses, 30 verses from Luke 6:20 to 49, whereas Matthew's is 3 chapters long. It's much longer. But as you can see here, the parts in blue are the parts in Luke, and the parts in green are the parts from Matthew. And the parts that are parallel are noted there, and the parts that are underlined are the way they're different. And I'm not making any suggestion here about who has changed each. We'll get to that theme in a moment. So we see the Beatitudes are similar, and again, no woes in Luke. And then there are various elements, and notice how they're spread out in Matthew. I did this in order of Luke, but notice we see here Matthew 5:11, and then Matthew 5:44, and then back to Matthew 5:39, back to 40, over to 42, then to 6:12, then back to 5:46, and then back to 5:7, and then finally to 7:1, whereas this is all in order in Luke. And so that's going to raise the question of what is the relationship between these two? And we can see the comparison goes down to the end to these sections from chapter 7 as well. And so that leads to the question overall of what's the relationship between Matthew and Luke. And I want to highlight just briefly 2 elements of that. I don't want to get into this in great detail. I'm not sure a lot can be determined. But one of the questions we have to ask is, did Luke take the Sermon on the Mount and shorten it? Did Matthew take the Sermon on the Plain and lengthen it? Or did both work from some other source and not know each other? That question really can't be answered, but I'd like to at least show 2 theories. One, the dominant theory that's lasted throughout most of the 20th and now in the 21st century, and a new one that's challenged it more recently. So the traditional view known as Q is based on this idea, that the Gospel of Mark, as we've been seeing, is a primary source for both Matthew and Luke. But there are elements, as we're seeing today, that are found in both Luke and Matthew, but not in Mark, and those are simply referred to as Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. In other words, it's a speculative, theoretical idea, drawing simply from a process of elimination. Take all the parts in Matthew and Luke that look like they're from Mark and take those out, and then take out all the parts in Matthew and Luke that seem unique to each, and then what's left, the parts they have in common that aren't from Mark. And that's simply called Q. And as they note there in the last part, then each has its own elements. But there are challenges to this view. Most prominently, no such manuscript of Q or anything like it has ever been found. For all the finding of ancient manuscripts like the Gnostic Gospels and the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things that have been found in caves and in locked rooms in various places throughout the Mediterranean and elsewhere that help us understand the biblical ancestry of texts, no manuscript or anything like Q has ever been found. And one would think if authors like Matthew and Luke had something like that, it might be found, or there may be a reference to it somewhere, that somebody might reference to a saying source or some other set of writings about Jesus other than the Gospels, but there's never been any evidence of that at all. Then we have to ask the question of priority and time of Luke or Matthew in 2 ways. How do we know that one didn't have the others? And the answer is we don't. Scholars generally like to suggest that both Matthew and Luke are writing after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, and scholars argue about whether Mark is written before or after that. I follow Ched Meyer's view that it was written most likely during the Jewish-Roman War from 66 to 70, but we don't have to worry about that for now. Most scholars would argue that Luke and Matthew are from some time after that, like in the 80s of the first century of the Common Era. But we don't know that, and there's no evidence in the text that gives us any more specific hint of exactly which one came from which. So we just don't know. And that leads to another view that's been promulgated just recently. And that takes us, as you can see in this screenshot from the web page, to the Matthew conflator hypothesis from Alan Garrow and others. And I won't go through this in detail, but if you're interested in this question, he provides a series of little videos that are very helpful in at least raising the question of whether it might be that Matthew came first and that Luke had Matthew to work with. And again, I won't get into that now. I don't think it matters for our purpose. But if you're interested in that question, I would really encourage you to take a look at that web page, and you can see the URL there at the top of that picture. So that sets up a little bit of what we're doing with the Sermon on the Plain. And as we'll begin next time, we'll look closely, not only at the language he's been doing throughout, but how the Sermon on the Plain points both backward and forward as a summary of what Luke's message of Jesus is throughout the gospel. See you next time for the blessings and woes. Bye-bye.